Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to Stately Von Manor, where Roger and I have returned. Because it's Wednesday, that means it's Epic Comic Book Wednesday. Every Wednesday, we'll talk about a certain comic book, graphic novel, or comic book subject. Steve Donoghue over on his channel will talk about the same comic book, graphic novel, or comic book subject. It is our world's finest team up that we do once a week. And for this, the first Epic Comic Book Wednesday of 2024, we've got a legendary comic book character to talk about. A truly important comic book character. Yes, let's go back in time to the year 1940 and the first issue of the unfortunately titled Whiz Comics, where we see for the first time Captain Marvel. Yes, it's Captain Marvel. Young Billy Batson follows a mysterious stranger into the subway. Don't do that, Billy, but he goes and does it. He follows a mysterious stranger into the subway and gets on board this goofy subway train where what? What? Well, who are we supposed to be talking about? Seriously, we got to talk about that guy? Okay. So, we're not talking about the real Captain Marvel this week. Sorry, everybody. So, this is the real Captain Marvel. He was published by Fawcett Comics for years and was incredibly popular. A lot of kids loved Captain Marvel, and for a time, Captain Marvel was the most popular superhero, even outselling Superman, which, kind of pissed off DC Comics. And so they sued. They sued Fawcett Comics, claiming that Captain Marvel was just a ripoff of Superman. Mostly they sued him for this because Captain Marvel is just a ripoff of Superman. But he had his own points of excellence, and while his power set was, well, kind of close to Superman, he actually was pretty different in a lot of ways. But DC Comics sued and they won. And this pretty much killed off the character of Captain Marvel, even though he was super popular. And Captain Marvel comics, they finished up, and no more Captain Marvel for years. Captain Marvel went away. He went away, and there was no Captain Marvel for a while. Actually, another comic book company came up with a short-lived run of Captain Marvel comics, or it wasn't the same character. They just gave this character the name Captain Marvel. But the less said about that particular comic book, the better. It didn't last very long. But then, in 1967, Martin Goodman, the owner of Marvel Comics and the big boss of Marvel Comics, Stan was the man, but he wasn't the man, Stan Lee. It was Martin Goodman. And Martin Goodman decided he wanted to have a character called Captain Marvel. And he ordered a sort of reluctant Stan Lee to come up with a brand new comic book character, and they would call it Captain Marvel, since nobody else were publishing a character at that particular time called Captain Marvel. So, if he publishes a comic book character called Captain Marvel, he copyright the name, and only he would own the name of Captain Marvel. Now, at this time, in 1967, most comic book fans who were real comic book fans remembered perfectly well the real Captain Marvel. And eventually, DC Comics started publishing, because they got the character. DC Comics, who killed off the original run of Captain Marvel, did bring the original Captain Marvel back, but they couldn't use the title because of Marvel. So they started calling their character, they just named it Shazam. Shazam was the wizard who gave Captain Marvel his powers. And Captain Marvel says Shazam, the word Shazam, and becomes Captain Marvel. Because he's young Billy Batson, a little kid. And he becomes Captain Marvel when he says Shazam. They called the comic book Shazam, or the Power of Shazam. Because on the covers, they couldn't use that name. Inside the comic book, they could call him Captain Marvel. but that was in the future. So this is 1967, and we end up with Marvel's Captain Marvel. Marvel's Captain Marvel. So Stan Lee is under orders to create a new Captain Marvel for Marvel Comics. There were some good ideas here. Let us go. This is the Captain Marvel omnibus because, you know, I have to have everything. So these are the first, how many issues are in this? I can't remember. So this Captain Marvel made his debut not as in his own book, but in a book called Marvel Superheroes. So we got Marvel Superheroes 12 and 13, and we've got Captain Marvel issues 1 through 33 in here, as well as a random, well, it's not random, as well as an issue of Iron Man. They had to throw in Iron Man because Thanos made his debut in that particular issue of Iron Man. So Captain Marvel. Now, this was Marvel's original idea for the character of Captain Marvel. This is what he looked like. He looked like this later, mostly because this particular character design was an utter failure. Basically, he's from outer space. He's a strange, mysterious visitor from outer space with powers and abilities far beyond those of mortal men. That's who he is, and he is Captain Marvel, and that's how he originally looked in Marvel Superheroes, the comic book where he debuted. There he is without his Kree mask, because Captain Marvel is a Kree. He's a Kree from outer space. Now, this first issue, it was presented with pride by Stan the Man Lee and Gene Colan. So Gene Colan does the artwork in this. And that's one of the reasons this is better than it possibly could have been, because I do like the artwork. It's not Colan's best artwork. It's not as good as a lot of the other stuff that Gene Colan did, Daredevil, and, you know, of course, his masterpiece, Tomb of Dracula. But it's not bad. It's not bad artwork. And we have Captain Marvel arriving here on Earth. He's actually Captain Marvel. He's Captain Marvel. Actually, that's what it says on the side here, Captain Marvel. Why didn't they just call this the Captain Marvel Omnibus and instead called it Marvel, his Kree name? That's a good question. Perhaps they didn't want to confuse you because there is yet another Captain Marvel running around in the Marvel Universe now. We'll get to that Captain Marvel in a minute. But the interesting thing about this original Captain Marvel, when he first arrived on the scene in his goofy outfit, this is actually the first issue of Captain Marvel. He got his own comic book after a couple issues of Marvel Superheroes. The thing about Captain Marvel when he first appeared is that Roy Thomas actually had a pretty good idea with this character. He is a Kree from outer space. He's part of a crew of aliens. And he goes down to Earth to check out Earth to see if it's a threat. And he's going to investigate the planet Earth. You know, and later see if they could invade it because they're aliens.
I just said Roy Thomas came up with that idea, but it was actually Stan Lee. Roy Thomas did do some work on this character behind the scenes and uncredited, but mostly that had to do with like the costume and some ideas like that. It was Stan Lee who came up with all of the ideas for the story itself.
And we had the potential for something really cool. And that is we had the potential for a series of comic books about a villain pretending to be a hero, which is almost what these first few issues are. Nobody knows that Captain Marvel is a Kree. He goes down, and Marvel, Captain Marvel, he is a captain of the Kree. He takes over the identity of this other guy, and he's spying, basically. And whenever something major happens, because, you know, there are supervillains attacking everywhere every 5 minutes in the Marvel Universe, he would get in his spacesuit to fight off whatever villain it was, and he became a superhero. Like, people thought, hey, there's a new superhero. It's Captain Marvel. Nobody knowing that he was actually a Kree spy from outer space. And if they had fully committed to that idea, the idea of an alien invader from outer space who's only using his identity to pretend to be a hero, that would have been a really interesting comic book. And it almost was that. It came close to being that. But Marvel, of course, that is, Captain Marvel, is a hero. You know, he's a good person. Of course, he's a good person. And he has sympathy for the Earthlings of planet Earth. So eventually, you know, he actually becomes a real hero. The comic book itself, it was not terrible, but it was not great. There are a lot of things, like I said, that I like about these early issues. Most of what I like about them is the artwork by Gene Colan. It's really cool. It's, like I said, it's not his best. But from the start, Captain Marvel was this outer space, cosmic kind of superhero. But I guess Marvel sold okay, but he didn't sell great. And there were some things that Roy Thomas, in particular, was not happy about how the character turned out. He didn't love the costume, even though he came up with the idea for the colors and everything of the costume. And so Gil Kane actually came on the book. And I think it was Gil Kane who helped redesign the costume to look like that. And Gil Kane came on, and there were some changes made to the book itself. So the artwork in this is really cool right there. So Gil Kane did a lot of cool work on Captain Marvel in the beginning. And they did this thing with Captain Marvel where they took Rick Jones. So Rick Jones, you can see Rick Jones here with the Hulk. Rick Jones was kind of a professional sidekick. He was a professional sidekick. He was the Hulk's sidekick for a while, and then he was Captain America's sidekick for a while, and he was sort of like, he was sort of the mascot, you know, for the Avengers in a way. He wasn't as bad as Snapper Carr over on, you know, the Justice League, but that's kind of the kind of character he was. And to continue his career as a professional sidekick, he joins the book Captain Marvel, but in an interesting way. So Captain Marvel, through a set of circumstances, gets trapped in, I think it was the negative zone. And he makes contact with Rick Jones. And this thing happens that when there's trouble, they can switch places. So Rick Jones goes about his life, and when there's trouble, he basically switches places with Captain Marvel. And it appears, you know, if you're just looking at the comic, like he becomes Captain Marvel. He goes away, Captain Marvel shows up, which is pretty much exactly what happened with the original real Captain Marvel, in that young Billy Batson, would become Captain Marvel when he said Shazam's name when there was trouble. So they took that from that basic concept from the original Captain Marvel comic books. They got this much cooler costume. The comic didn't really take off, though, until Jim Starlin took over the book. And once Jim Starlin took over Captain Marvel, it became much more interesting, and he became the cosmic superhero, where he would fight cosmic menaces and outer space stuff and Thanos, and it became a really interesting looking book once Starlin came aboard. The character of Captain Marvel, though, I don't know if he was anyone's favorite. Probably the best thing Captain Marvel ever did was die. Because eventually Captain Marvel did die in an original Captain Marvel, the death of Captain Marvel, which was fantastic. And unlike every other Marvel superhero that died that I could think of, Captain Marvel, that mostly stuck, right? I haven't read a ton of comics in the last 20 years, but I can't recall the original Captain Marvel returning permanently in comics as the real guy. He was replaced a couple times by a couple different Captain Marvels, including the Captain Marvel that you are probably familiar with now from the cinema, which would be this Captain Marvel, which was Miss Marvel at one time. Unfortunately, I cannot show you the death of Captain Marvel because I do not have it. If I ever get it, we will do an Epic Comic Book Wednesday on that graphic novel because it was fantastic. Just great. Better than the entire Captain Marvel series that came before. Although this wasn't terrible. It just was okay for most of its run, I think, with some really interesting Starlin issues. Once he got it, he took it into some interesting places. But nowadays, both the original Captain Marvel, this guy is still around, and they've made a couple movies about this guy. Only they call him Shazam now. Like his original name, Captain Marvel, just went away completely, and now he's just Shazam. But he's Captain Marvel. But he's not, because this is Captain Marvel now. This is Carol Danvers, no relation to Supergirl. Carol Danvers, who was Miss Marvel, who was a character in the original Marvel version of Captain Marvel comic books. She is now Captain Marvel, and they made a couple movies off of this Captain Marvel. I saw the first one. I didn't think it was great. I think it was just, I mean, I think by that point, I mean, this is just my opinion, Roger. I think at that point, I think the Marvel movies had kind of lost their magic. Certainly, it seems so in the film version of this character. I actually don't hate this character. At least, from what I've read of this character, which I think this was the last thing I read of this character. Nothing major, nothing great, but this is a character Marvel nowadays really, really, really wants you to like. And the problem is that I think with Marvel, they never really had a Wonder Woman, They never really had a female character that was that interesting and that good. I mean, DC Comics has a female character that is as good as Superman and Batman and has been selling that whole time, and it has, that's a major character. Marvel, from what I can remember, when they would make a comic book about a female superhero, it would be like usually a female version of a male superhero. Spider-Woman, She-Hulk, even Captain Marvel. It was a male character, then they made it a female character. They don't have a Wonder Woman. They do. I mean, they've got Black Widow. Black Widow is pretty cool, but she's not in the same league, I don't think. Now, I must say that this original Captain Marvel did make it into those Captain Marvel movies. But he was played by Annette Bening. I only wish I was making that up. He was played by Annette Bening. No respect, Marvel. But this is an interesting thing that happened in Marvel Comics, where the order was given to create Captain Marvel, really just so that they would have the name copyrighted. And kind of this interesting idea that basically Roy Thomas had to make this outer space hero And this, like I said, this could have been a groundbreaking, interesting comic if they had fully committed to the original concept that they had about this Kree who was a spy and, you know, kind of acting like a superhero or taking the place of a superhero. But they didn't really fully commit to that idea, and they went in another direction. And we came up with some interesting comics from Starlin and some good artwork from Gil Kane. But it's never been my favorite. It's never been my favorite. To me, he's just kind of like an interesting phenomenon. And it's interesting to me that Marvel is still trying to sell this character just so hard. They've really been pushing this one to, I don't think, to great success. Now, the state of the Marvel Cinematic Universe is a whole other thing. I pretty much, like I said, I've been off. I haven't been on board for a while. Not for a while. Even before Endgame, I was like, But that's a whole other video. We could talk about that some other time, maybe. And someday, we will actually talk about the real Captain Marvel. Let me know if you want me to talk about the real Captain Marvel. That would be fun to do. I like the real Captain Marvel. Okay, guys, I will catch you next time.